A Paltry and Hollow Budget, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's Critique of the Bombay Presidency Budget, 1938. Speaker, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Occasion, Bombay Legislative Assembly Session. Date, March 2, 1938. Context, the first year of the Congress government in Bombay Presidency following the 1937 provincial elections. Significance, the speech offers a critical analysis of the Congress government's first budget, revealing Dr. Ambedkar's concerns regarding their financial policies and priorities. Focus on social justice, Dr. Ambedkar's critique centers on the budget's failure to address the pressing needs of the marginalized and impoverished population. A call for fiscal responsibility, he emphasizes the need for responsible and equitable allocation of resources to uplift the masses and achieve true social progress. Historical context, the speech provides valuable insights into the political and economic landscape of pre-independence India and the challenges faced by marginalized communities. A lasting legacy, Dr. Ambedkar's sharp and insightful critique continues to resonate today, highlighting the importance of social justice and equitable development in policymaking. The illusion of praise. Initial commendations, the budget received praise from other members of the Assembly. Dr. Ambedkar's surprise, Dr. Ambedkar expresses surprise at the commendations, finding the budget deeply flawed. A paltry and hollow budget. He characterizes the budget as paltry, hollow, and lacking vision. No recognition of problems, Dr. Ambedkar argues that the budget fails to address the crucial problems facing the presidency. Substantiating his critique, he promises to provide detailed arguments to support his harsh assessment of the budget. A rare point of praise, Dr. Ambedkar acknowledges one positive item in the budget, an increase in police force funding. Crediting the Home Minister, he attributes this increase to the Home Minister, not the Finance Minister. A shift in Congress's stance, Dr. Ambedkar points to the Congress's changing relationship with the police force. The Congress's true colors, he suggests that the Congress is using the police force for its own ends, particularly against labor movements. The Dharavi firing incident. He references a recent firing incident at Dharavi as an example of the Congress's use of force against labor. Examples of financial impropriety. 5 problematic items. Dr. Ambedkar highlights 5 budget items that he considers examples of financial impropriety. Lack of concrete schemes. He criticizes the inclusion of funding for items without established plans for implementation. Absence of legislative approval. He points out that the Assembly hasn't passed legislation for these expenditures, effectively giving the government a blank check. A sum of 31 lakhs rupees, these questionable expenditures amount to 31 lakhs of rupees. Proportion of new items, this constitutes a significant portion of the total new items added to the existing budget, which is around 1.16 lakhs. Encroaching on Assembly privileges. Dr. Ambedkar sees this as an encroachment on the Assembly's authority to scrutinize and approve expenditures. Comparison to the Home Minister's actions, he draws a parallel to the Home Minister's attempts to bypass Assembly approval for government rules. Distinction between types of rules, he distinguishes between rules that simply execute administrative policy and those that become part of the law itself. Asserting the Assembly's right, Dr. Ambedkar insists that the Assembly has the right to review and approve rules that form part of the law. The Congress's pattern of encroachment, he sees the Congress government repeatedly encroaching on the Assembly's privileges. The Finance Department's crucial role. The devolution rules. Dr. Ambedkar refers to the devolution rules framed under the previous Government of India Act, 1919. The Finance Department as watchdog. He highlights the principle that the Finance Department should act as a watchdog, scrutinizing expenditures proposed by other departments. Ensuring financial propriety. The Finance Department's role is to ensure that expenditure requests are necessary, financially feasible, and properly itemized. The importance of itemization. Dr. Ambedkar emphasizes the need for detailed itemization to enable the Assembly and the Audit Department to track spending. Condemning the government's conduct. He criticizes the government for seeking a lump sum of 31 lakhs without proper itemization. Audacity of the government. he labels the government's actions audacious and inexcusable. Permanent principles of financial control. Dr. Ambedkar argues that even though the 1919 Act is no longer in effect, the principles enshrined in the devolution rules regarding financial control should remain permanent. Upholding legislative control over executive, he underscores the importance of the legislature's control over the executive branch through financial scrutiny. A call for transparency and accountability. Dr. Ambedkar's arguments highlight the need for transparency and accountability in government spending. Consequences of lack of scrutiny. He implies that the lack of proper financial scrutiny can lead to misuse of public funds and undermine, dismantling the illusion of expansion. New items and real expansion. Dr. Ambedkar questions whether the new items added to the budget represent genuine expansion of activities. Total value of new items. He notes that the new items amount to Rs. 1,16,67,000. Deduction for non-recurring expenditure. He argues that Rs. 48,11,000 of this expenditure is non-recurring, meaning it's meant for temporary needs and not permanent additions to social services. Net addition for permanent expenditure. After deducting non-recurring expenditure, the actual addition for permanent expenditure is Rs. 68,56,000. Further deduction for prohibition. Dr. Ambedkar then deducts Rs. 31,45,000 allocated to prohibition, considering it a negative item that reduces revenue rather than adding to social services. The meager true budget for permanent expenditure. This leaves only Rs. 37,11,000 as the real budget for permanent expenditure. The disappointing reality. Dr. Ambedkar emphasizes the paltry sum allocated for genuine expansion of social services. Questioning the government's sense of responsibility, he challenges the government's sense of responsibility and adequacy in providing only Rs. 37,11,000 for the needs of the presidency. Highlighting the dire needs, he points to the widespread illiteracy, poor health, and prevalence of diseases like malaria, gonorrhea, and syphilis as urgent issues requiring significant investment. Dismissing the finance minister's laughter. Dr. Ambedkar criticizes the finance minister's laughter at his assessment, calling it dismissive and lacking empathy. A budget built on shifting sands. The sustainability of funding. Dr. Ambedkar questions the long-term viability of the funding sources for the new budget items. Sources of funding. He identifies the finance minister's reliance on a surplus from the current year's budget, Rs. 10,50,000, drawing from current balances, 63 rupees lakhs, and anticipated additional yield from taxes, 8 rupees lakhs. Analyzing the sources, he then analyzes the sustainability of these sources. Excise and stamps revenue. Dr. Ambedkar points out that the current year's surplus is largely due to increased revenue from excise and stamps, Rs. 21,52,000, which he believes is unreliable. Tainted money. He calls the excise revenue, tainted money, likely referring to his moral opposition to alcohol consumption. Unlikely recurrence. He argues that this increased revenue from excise and stamps is unlikely to recur. Uncertainty of income tax revenue. He acknowledges the government's receipt of 27 rupees lakhs as income tax returns but considers it a contingent item that may not be reliable in the future. The sole dependable source. This leaves only the Rs. 8 lakhs expected from remodeling tobacco taxation as a dependable source of revenue for the additional expenditure of 37 rupees lakhs. The unacknowledged liabilities. The true extent of government responsibilities. Dr. Ambedkar shifts the focus to the broader responsibilities that the government should undertake, beyond the immediate budget allocations. A call for comprehensive understanding. He urges both sides of the assembly to acknowledge the full scope of their duties towards the people's welfare. Traditional government functions. He identifies the traditional functions of government, such as education, public health, medical relief, and water supply. The Congress's expanded vision. He then refers to the Congress government statement on labor policy issued on August 17, 1937, where they acknowledged a broader set of responsibilities. Modern welfare state responsibilities. These responsibilities include unemployment benefits, sickness insurance, old age pensions, maternity benefits, and death benefits for dependents. The need for financial planning. Dr. Ambedkar stresses the need to estimate the financial implications of fulfilling these broader responsibilities. A request to the finance minister. He calls on the finance minister to provide an estimate of the total financial liability involved in undertaking these obligations. Dr. Ambedkar's own estimate, based on his own calculations, he estimates the total liabilities of the presidency to be around 24 crores of rupees. The daunting challenge. He acknowledges the massive financial challenge this represents, regardless of which government is in power. A call for awareness and action. Dr. Ambedkar urges the government to be fully aware of its obligations and develop a concrete plan to meet them. A stark global comparison. The problem of raising 24 crores. Dr. Ambedkar raises the crucial question of how the presidency can raise the estimated 24 crores needed to fulfill its responsibilities. Comparing global revenue, he draws a comparison with per capita revenue figures from other countries to highlight the inadequacy of the presidency's financial resources. Specific figures, he presents per capita revenue figures in pounds, shillings, and pence for Canada, South Australia, New South Wales, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Australia, and the Irish Free State. Bombay's dismal position. In stark contrast, he highlights Bombay's per capita revenue as a mere 7 pence. A staggering picture. He labels this comparison a staggering picture and a contrast that should alarm any finance minister genuinely committed to the people's welfare. The implication of low revenue. The comparison underscores the severe limitations imposed by low per capita revenue on the presidency's ability to provide essential services and uplift the population. A wake-up call. This global comparison serves as a wake-up call to the government. A global perspective. Dr. Ambedkar's use of international comparisons demonstrates his awareness of global standards and his desire to benchmark the presidency's progress against other nations. Stagnant revenues and vanishing assets. The problem of stagnant revenues. Dr. Ambedkar points to the problem of stagnant revenues in the presidency, further compounding the financial challenges. Citing the finance minister's own words, he quotes the finance minister's previous budget speech, which provided data on revenue growth in different provinces between 1922 and 1935. Inter-provincial comparison, he presents figures showing the percentage increase in revenue for Madras, Punjab, United Provinces, Assam, and Bengal. Bombay's meager growth. In contrast, Bombay's revenue growth during this period was a mere 3%. The reality of declining revenue. He reveals that even this 3% growth is misleading, as it includes revenue from additional taxation imposed between 1922 and 1935. Factoring out additional taxation, when adjusted for additional taxation, the presidency's revenue actually decreased by 5.5% during this period. The impact of policy decisions. Dr. Ambedkar then considers the impact of the government's policy decisions on future revenue. Prohibition and land revenue reduction. He identifies prohibition and the proposed reduction in land revenue as policies that will further deplete the presidency's resources. The dwindling revenue base. Dr. Ambedkar paints a bleak picture of the presidency's dwindling revenue base, raising serious concerns about its ability to finance. A retrograde budget. Condemning the budget's approach, Dr. Ambedkar criticizes the budget as retrograde, signifying a backward step rather than progress. Accusation of betrayal. He accuses the government of going back on its promises and abandoning the progressive stance it had previously adopted. Contrasting with the previous budget speech, he contrasts the current budget speech with the finance minister's speech from the previous year, highlighting the latter's boldness and radicalism. Recalling the promises made, Dr. Ambedkar reads excerpts from the previous speech where the finance minister acknowledged the need for new revenue sources and a more equitable distribution of the tax burden. The finance minister's commitment to reform. He reminds the Assembly of the finance minister's pledges to introduce a graded tax on agricultural incomes, re-examine existing taxes, and explore new avenues for revenue generation, including nationalization of public utilities. The missing elements in the current budget. A rich man's budget. Criticizing the lack of new taxation, Dr. Ambedkar expresses strong disapproval of the government's decision not to introduce new taxes. The poor bear the burden. He argues that this decision primarily benefits the rich, while the poor continue to bear the brunt of existing taxes. A rich man's budget. He labels the budget a rich man's budget, highlighting its failure to address the needs and concerns of the poor. The rich versus the poor. Dr. Ambedkar draws a sharp contrast between the needs of the rich and the poor. The rich man's independence. He argues that the rich can afford to be independent of government services. Examples of self-sufficiency. He gives examples like education and healthcare, stating that the rich can afford private tutors and doctors, while the poor rely on government services. The poor's dependence on government. In contrast, the poor desperately need government support to access basic necessities and improve their living conditions. Condemnation of government inaction. He criticizes the government's lack of courage in implementing new taxes to fund programs for the poor. A call for abdication. He goes so far as to suggest that a government unwilling to tax the rich to help the poor should step down. The moral imperative of governance. His argument emphasizes the moral imperative of governance to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable and work towards a more just and equitable society. Beyond social services, tackling poverty. The limitations of social services. He argues that the government should go beyond simply providing social services and focus on the root cause of the problem, poverty. A broader vision. He advocates for a more comprehensive approach that aims to increase the national income. A nation of beggars and coolies. He uses a stark phrase to describe the state of the people, highlighting the widespread poverty and lack of economic opportunities. The government's responsibility. He asserts that the government has a fundamental duty to address this problem and create conditions for economic upliftment. Questioning the budget's focus. He challenges the budget's lack of any indication that the government is aware of this crucial issue or has a plan to tackle it. The fallacy of land revenue reduction. Dr. Ambedkar then addresses a common belief that reducing land revenue is the primary solution to alleviate poverty. Supporting land revenue reduction. While he supports reducing the burden of land revenue on farmers, he argues that it's not a panacea for poverty. Calculating the impact of complete remission. To illustrate his point, he calculates the per capita benefit if the entire land revenue of 3.5 crores was remitted and distributed among the 2 crore population. A negligible increase in income. The result is a paltry increase of 1 rupee in 8 annas per person annually, or 2.5 annas per month.